Humans have told some great stories over recorded history. The only problem is that most of the ideas are unoriginal. Time and time again, our most popular tales are clearly rip-offs from something that came before, but that doesn't stop them from dominating our attention. The best modern example is Star Wars. We always hear how these movies changed how we tell stories, but it goes deeper than that.
Everything in our society, or at least the way I see it, was shaped by that movie. We're the Star Wars generation, and it is, in a sense, our religious culture. You got a crowd of people, they're congregating, they're sharing their experience for the most part, they're sharing their knowledge, and really geeky, trivial knowledge and stuff.
I like the fact that it's quasi-religious and spiritual, but in a very sort of fashionable and easy to understand way. It means a lot to me.
And while I agree Star Wars is cool, only the first three. It's not a religion, but it does share one aspect with it. It's built on a foundation of rehashing stories that came before. Star Wars was assembled from smaller parts from all kinds of previous works, and when you take the time to compare these similarities, it becomes obvious to even the most dedicated fan that Star Wars is not some revolutionary story, but instead is one inspired from earlier ideas. It's nice to have these other works so that we can prove that Star Wars wasn't just created out of thin air. For centuries, that is what happened with the biblical story of Noah's Ark. While there were other flood myths from other cultures and religions, the Judeo-Christian version is the one that stands as the most prevalent and widely known. I want to point out now that this is not a scientific look at Noah's Ark, but a textual one. Noah's Ark is found in chapters 6 through 9 of the book of Genesis. As far as determining how old Genesis is and when it was written, there are two types of people that you can listen to. First, there are scholars who seriously study biblical texts, and they have degrees from respected universities, and they publish in peer-reviewed journals. And then, there are the types who graduated from Patriot Bible College, or those who run websites with animated graphics from 1995. They claim Genesis was written by Moses himself thousands and thousands of years ago. Biblical scholars who are overwhelmingly religious themselves have said for the past century that Genesis was produced by multiple authors in the 5th century BC. But more recent scholarship pushes it back into the 6th century BC. But because this was a pre-literate culture where the ability to read was restricted to the scribal elites, these stories would have been passed orally for many years. Here's a quick look at the story as we know it. God becomes upset at the sinful nature of man, so he decides to start fresh by giving it all a good wash. He has one chosen man, Noah, who was righteous in his generation. So God contacts Noah and tells him to build an ark for his family and to put animals on it as well. Noah builds it, puts his family and all the animals on it. A huge flood comes and kills all the living inhabitants of earth. At the end of it, Noah sends out a bird to see if there's any dry land. It comes back, so he waits a while, then he sends it out again. He learns that there's dry land and that the waters are going down. He gets out, makes a sacrifice to God, and man and God are on good terms again. It's actually told twice in Genesis, and there's some differences between the two, such as how many animals were on the ark, how long the flood lasted, and what birds were sent. For centuries, Noah's Ark was considered to be reporting history. While there are obvious scientific objections not discussed here, the story was able to withstand textual attacks. All that changed in the mid-1800s with the founding of Assyriology, which is the study and unearthing of ancient Mesopotamia. In 1853, an Iraqi Christian named Hormuz Rassam uncovered a library belonging to a Mesopotamian king. There, amid an unsurpassed collection of ancient manuscripts, Rassam found 12 clay tablets containing writing in cuneiform, the earliest known form of writing. It was indecipherable at that time. A decade later, after cuneiform could finally be translated, it was discovered that these tablets contained one of the oldest known stories in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian epic poem. While these particular tablets were dated to the 7th century BC, this was just the first copy that we found. Multiple partial manuscripts would later be found in various places, and scholars say that the story on the tablets originally began as 5 separate poems that were composed no earlier than 2000 BC. But, like Genesis, they were much likely older than that. Manuscripts discovered over the years show that these 5 poems started being combined with other additions into one document around 1200 to 1300 BC. The story follows Gilgamesh, a hero who seeks to attain immortality after his friend Enkidu dies. In the 11th tablet, he seeks out a man named Utnapishtim, the survivor of a worldwide catastrophe who became immortal himself. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he survived this catastrophe. See if this sounds familiar.
Utnapishtim spoke to Gilgamesh, saying, I will reveal to you, Gilgamesh, a thing that is hidden. A secret of the gods I will tell you. Shuruppak, a city that you surely know situated on the banks of the Euphrates, that city was very old, and there were gods inside it. The hearts of the great gods moved them to inflict the flood. Aya, the clever god, was under oath with them, but he repeated their talk to me. Oh, man of Shuruppak, tear down the house and build a boat. Abandon wealth and seek living beings. Spurn possessions and keep alive living beings. Make all living beings go up into the boat which you are to build. Its dimensions must measure equal to each other. Its length must correspond to its width. Roof it over like the Apsu. The boat was finished by sunset. The launching was very difficult. I had all my kith and kin go up into the boat. All the beasts and animals of the field and the craftsmen I had go up. The weather was frightful to behold. I went into the boat and sealed the entry. There arose from the horizon a black cloud, and turned to blackness all that had been light. The land shattered like a pot. All day long the south wind blew, blowing fast, submerging the mountain in water, overwhelming the people like an attack. No one could see his fellow. They could not recognize each other in the torrent. The gods were frightened by the flood. 6 days and 7 nights came the wind and flood, the storm flattening the land. When the 7th day arrived, the sea calmed. Quiet had set in. I sent forth the dove and released it. The dove went off, but came back to me. I sent forth a swallow and released it. The swallow went off, but came back to me. I sent forth a raven and released it. The raven went off, but does not circle back to me. Then I sent out everything in all directions and sacrificed a sheep. I offered incense in front of the mountain ziggurat. The gods smelled the sweet savor and collected like flies over the sacrifice.
All neutral and open-minded people watching this right now immediately think the same thing. This is the same story. Noah's Ark is ripping off Gilgamesh. Amazing, isn't it? Now, there are obvious differences. There were different amounts of gods. The boats were different. Utnapishtim sent out an extra bird to find dry land. And where God was immediately sorry following the flood, Gilgamesh gods were still pretty pissed off before they finally cooled down and granted Utnapishtim immortality. But there are those who are not open-minded and who want to figure out how to still make Noah's Ark the definitive version. To do that, they will parachute out of here and they will go to Google and they'll find what some 1995 style website has to say about it. Let me go ahead and tell you what their argument is. They say that all of these stories are all reporting the same event, but the Noah version is the accurate one. How they get to the latter part is very weak, if not outright intellectually dishonest. They say Genesis is not literary dependent on Gilgamesh. Literary dependence simply means one text's reuse of the language of another text. The argument here is that the characters are not the same, the words aren't exactly the same, the phrasing isn't the same, the theology isn't the same, therefore, the stories are different. Then they sometimes like to argue who has the better science, and they point to the boats. Gilgamesh's was square and not seaworthy. Noah's was like a cruise ship. So now they want to bring in science and argue. Which magical story is more believable? The one with the family of sky fairies and a sea captain who gets to live forever? Or the one with the murderer who lives in the clouds who hates everyone except his favorite floating zookeeper? But don't get sidetracked here. Just take their argument and follow it through to its logical conclusion. That it took the Noah authors 1,000 years before finally getting around to putting the true version down on paper. If you consider their composition dates, the distances between the earliest Gilgamesh writings and the completion of Genesis is almost the same amount of time that has elapsed from Noah to us. That's even worse than us saying, hey, I know Beowulf was written around 800 AD and that was a long time ago, but look, that's not how it happened. See, my grandfather and his grandfather and his grandfather, all the way back to before Beowulf was written, see, we've been telling it different. and we have the real version. See, here's how it really happened.
Yeah, all right, I'll see you guys there.
And let's pile on the creationists some more here. I've already said that Noah borrowed from Gilgamesh, but guess what? Gilgamesh isn't original either. Gilgamesh took its story from an earlier Akkadian epic poem called the Epic of Atrahasis, which was completed 500 years before Gilgamesh was assembled. Atrahasis tells the same flood story, but the main character's name's different, and a few facts are off, but the overall story is the same. So how does that bode for Noah? Now we have two predecessors over 1,000 years before with the same story. But guess what? Atrahasis ain't original either. There is another Sumerian flood myth from around this time that was found on a single busted fragmentary tablet that follows a character whose name is Ziusudra. A huge portion of this story, as you can see, is missing. But on the parts that we do have, guess what outlandish hijinks occur? Yep, you guessed it. He loads up animals on a large boat to avoid a worldwide flood from some pissed off gods. And now, at last, we have 4 flood stories, only slightly different from each other. But there are still those who argue that the youngest of them, by 1,000 years, is actually the accurate one. So why do I bring this up when the flood stories themselves are obviously myths? Because a lot of people don't think that they are. And those that are open to the idea of it not being true, well, they can be convinced when you show them that Noah's Ark is a ripoff of a ripoff of a ripoff. But many have a vested interest in this story, and they don't like people messing with that. Like Star Wars. And like Star Wars, you might be able to make your case just a little bit better if you can just demonstrate a passable level of understanding of the source material.
What's that film that you love?
What film?
The one about the fucking hairdresser, the space hairdresser and the cowboy. The guy's, he's got a tinfoil pal and a pedal bin. His father's a robot and he's fucking fucked his sister. Lego. They're all made of fucking Lego.
Star Wars.
That's the one, right. It's like that, okay. You're gonna fucking kill all the bad guys. And you'll be able to blow up the big...
The Death Star.
The Death Star thing.
Yes.
Then you can go and live happily ever after on the planet of the teddy bears.
They're Ewoks. It's a fantastic analogy. Well done.